that many internet atheists seem to think that people like Matt Dillahunty have already resolved this issue of the Kalam, when, as we saw in the debate, Matt's not familiar with, I don't think, some of the terminology, some of the issues that are raised in this discussion. For example, there's this great moment in the debate where he says, I say, how is it that the universe could be past infinite? He says, how could your God be past infinite? I said, well, he's timeless. He says, well, it doesn't matter what you believe. And I said, no, I'm just telling you definitionally he's timeless. We have this back and forth. He didn't understand that what I was saying was, if God is timeless, then he's not past infinite. He's timeless. Those are different categories. Infinite, past infinite, is temporal language. It's temporal and infinite. Timeless is not temporal. Those are completely different categories. And it threw me in the debate because I had to realize, oh, wait a minute, he doesn't understand that these are different. And so when I finally pointed it out, so he's not infinite into the past, he's timeless. He says, oh, yeah, you didn't say that before. Okay, well, we're okay, then move on. And I was shocked because Matt's supposed to be the guy who has thoroughly debunked the Kalam argument. Well, welcome to this commentary on the debate review from Matt Dillahunty. Now, I know that for some of you, this is getting old because, after all, when the debate was first released, not even released yet, we did a review on Trinity Radio of it, and you can watch that there. And then Matt did a miniature debate review on his channel, and then we did a review or discussion of some of the internet YouTube atheists and what they had to say in the comment stream. And now Matt has released a lengthier review of the debate that is his kind of official debate review. On top of that, there have been YouTube atheists who have made their own videos about this, and there have been Christian YouTubers who have made their own videos about the debate. So the debate's kind of made a splash, and I'm glad for that. And I've done about 6 interviews about the debate so far. So if you want to see all of that kind of stuff, I've compiled it into a page on my website. If you go to braxtonhunter.com and go to the debates page, read the description for the debate video for the Matt Dillahunty debate, and you'll see where it says click here. That takes you to another page that has all of the stuff there. You'll notice that I'm today flying solo. There is no Dr. Jonathan Pritchett, and for some of you, I realize that seems scary and unnatural, and I sympathize with those feelings. I feel the same way, but I thought it would be good to go over this on my own because if Jonathan and I were having a discussion about it, it would be a much longer video than I think it needs to be. And so I'm just going to give you my thoughts as we move on through this. This will not interrupt our regular Trinity Radio episodes, which will soon be posted. Also, for those of you that have watched all this stuff, Matt says some things here that I think give us an opportunity to learn some things, to clarify some things, and maybe point out some things that I think maybe Matt missed from the debate, and I know that others have missed. And so I think it's valuable for us to go through this. And my hope is that as you listen, you will take Matt seriously and look for maybe some possible mistakes that I think are there. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin looking at Matt's recap of the debate. Here we go.
The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents the debate review, Matt Dillahunty versus Braxton Hunter, Does the Christian God Exist? Hi, I posted this video at the beginning of March. We had done it about a week prior to when I posted it, and I guess it's also available on Braxton's YouTube channel as well, so you can see that we posted the same thing. And before I posted the video, I posted a miniature partial review. It doesn't cover the debate in detail, and this one's not going to either. It's going to cover a couple things and then an ancillary subject. But the video that I posted was about sort of the debate itself, but the extra rebuttal that the moderator did, which many people pointed out. I don't have an objection to it. I'm not going to reiterate everything I said in that other video, but it's their event. They can do this, and I think that the extra rebuttal or the closing remarks really undermined the case that Braxton was trying to make. And so if anybody should be upset about it more than me, it would be Braxton, because essentially the moderator just said, yep, you're not going to find evidence of God, trust your inner voice, go with your gut, which was my primary objection.
Okay, so first of all, I want to clear up this thing about Dr. Leighton Flowers. Leighton was the moderator for this event, and this has been probably the most discussed aspect of this debate. Honestly, I mean that's a little bit strange to me. Not from Christian viewers. Christian viewers, for the most part, have wanted to talk about the arguments, and a lot of the atheist community has as well. So I'm not trying to. I'm not that. That's not meant as a dig at them. But it's true that most of the comments that I've seen have to do with the fact that towards the end of the debate, Leighton kind of gives a little bit of a pastoral word. And I think he even calls it that. It's not meant to be a rebuttal. It's not even meant to be an official part of the debate. He kind of gives his thoughts and closes out. What people have interpreted this as Leighton trying to work against the point that I'm raising, that there is great evidence to believe in the existence of the Christian God. This could not be further from the truth. Leighton is not confused about what apologetics is. And in fact, I'll encourage you to go check out the episode that I did with Leighton. If you'll just go to YouTube and search Leighton Flowers and then look for the episode we did together about this. We've done several episodes in the past, but there's one that is about this debate, and he gets to clarify this in his own words. But I just want to say this here. This is not a point that is at all confusing or unusual for Christian apologists in apologetic circles. It is very common for Christian apologists to point out. William Lane Craig does this, especially in the book. He does it I think in Reasonable Faith, but also in the book, 5 Views on Apologetics. He goes into great detail about the fact that it is Christian apologetics and the explanation of evidence and arguments and the reasons that we believe. It is by those things that we show other people that Christianity is true. This external evidence. This is how we show that Christianity is true. It is by the internal witness that we know that Christianity is true. And we understand that the personal experience, the personal subjective conscious experience of the individual Christian does not necessarily count as evidence for someone else to believe. They can't get inside of our head and see what we're experiencing. But it's for us. It's an internal way that we can know. The apologetics is how we show others that is true, because we point to these external aspects of the nature of reality that they do have access to. This is not at all unusual. Christian philosophers, Christian theologians, Christian apologists have been talking about this with skeptics for a long, long time. It's not unusual at all. All Leighton was doing was saying, look, you've heard all this evidence. That's great. But here's the thing. If you really want to know for sure, then don't look to signs and wonders, which, by the way, isn't the same thing as external evidence, and just have a personal experience with the Lord Jesus by searching for him with all your heart and looking for that still small voice. There is a clear difference between knowing and showing. That is all that was being discussed here. And I've talked with Leighton. I understood that to be what he meant from the jump. So is Braxton upset about this? Not at all, because Braxton understood what was going on. And so if I seem a little bit defensive on Leighton's behalf here, there's a good reason for that. I see people getting upset with the moderator for making some kind of a third rebuttal when that wasn't at all what was happening. Leighton was simply encouraging people to have an internal personal experience with the Lord, which is the point, after all, is we want to get people to the point where they're ready to do that. So I thought it was incredibly appropriate. I'm not trying to criticize Matt for this, because I don't know that he knows that. I don't know that he's heard that those comments from Christian philosophers, apologists, and thinkers, but I wanted to point it out here. So let's continue now.
One of the things that came up in the debate, though, was that I'm too skeptical. That my standards of evidence are so high that there's functionally nothing that could convince me that God exists. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I wanted to note that my feelings of the debate, and I haven't gone back and rewatched every part of it yet, I generally am hypercritical of myself, which is why I love doing these debate reviews, because I get to go back and find not just mistakes my opponent made, but mistakes that I made that we can all correct on. And I will say that while my opening statement hit most of the points that I had wanted to hit coming in there, I don't really like my opening remarks from that debate.
Okay, now, if I remember correctly, this is about all he says about what he didn't like about his opening statements. We don't get a lot of detail about that. But let me just go ahead and remind anyone who watched the debate that what we get is we get at least half of the opening statements, if I'm not mistaken, that are his personal testimony of deconversion, which I don't feel impressed to comment upon. I mean, it's not in any sense an argument. It can be persuasive to people, but not for any real good reason. It's just him explaining what happened to him. And in some respects is kind of like what happened at the end of the debate when Leighton gave his personal testimony about his experience with God. Matt is here giving his personal testimony about his deconversion experience, or however you want to frame that up soteriologically. So most of that I didn't really see a good reason to comment on or respond to, and I say that in the debate. It's only in the second half of his opening statements that he actually does say a couple of things. And when I say a couple of things, I think there was only two things. And he's going to tell us what they are. It's the divine hiddenness argument and what he calls inconsistent revelations. Now, we're going to talk more about that in just a moment, but I do want to say that this is the problem I would have with these opening statements. And I say this constructively to Matt because I do, if I haven't said it enough, I do like Matt. I think I would enjoy being around Matt. Some other YouTube atheist says, what do you mean saying that Matt's a nice guy? Listen, we're on Matt's side, but he is not a nice guy. I don't know that that's an exact quote, but that was the sentiment. And I don't get that at all. I get that he makes some very offensive, angry comments sometimes on his show. But the thing about it is, I still like him for the same reasons that I used to like Christopher Hitchens. Even though Christopher Hitchens was just as fiery and just as offensive or blasphemous or whatever, the fact of the matter is, I still liked the guy. You know, it has part to do with his personality, his ability as an orator and turn a phrase, and so I like the guy. So I say this not intending to be offensive, but if I were to critique, I would say this. If you're going to make a habit out of debating, which he has now, he's had more debates than I've had. I think it must be in the high 20s or 30-something debates, just talking about, on stage debates with Christians and other people. The fact of the matter is I really think you need to bring some formal arguments, and you can put about anything together as a formal argument. And the reason for that is it's because that's an actual argument where you can look to the premises and find out, does this thing work? Are there logical fallacies? Matt loves to talk about logical fallacies all the time. Well, it kind of obfuscates, a word that's going to come up again in this video, it kind of obfuscates the discussion and what you're really trying to say if you don't put these things into syllogistic form or some kind of a structured argument so that we can actually take it apart and see if it holds water. Instead, what Matt does for us is give us kind of a folksy sort of meandering around in the discussion. And so it makes it hard to know exactly what you're trying to say, as well as it makes it hard to see where the weaknesses are. But of course, I'm going to point some of those things out and did in the debate. But I want to point out that I think that's a problem. I think you need to be more structured in this and take this a bit more seriously in the terms of actual argumentation instead of just kind of telling me, how you feel about it. But let's go ahead and take a look at what he says.
I think that there was a better way to do it, and the next time that I debate this subject of, is it rational to accept Christianity? Does the Christian God exist? Anything that's specific about the doctrine of Christianity. I'm going to change my opening slightly. I still am a fan of both the argument from divine hiddenness, that essentially we don't see evidence where we would expect to see evidence. This universe looks nothing like what we would expect if, in fact, the Christian God existed. The second argument that I presented in the opening, and I didn't present either of these in great detail. I just sort of, they go by almost as quickly as I'm doing them here. But the second one was the argument from inconsistent revelation, essentially that we have 1,000 denominations or more that identify as Christian, and they disagree on every single point of doctrine and have seemingly forever. And that this is inconsistent with the notion that there is a God with an important message. It would seem that clearing up this message and clearing up the confusion would be a primary concern of a God. And And so the fact that people come to different conclusions about what must one do to be saved, both things that are critical to that soteriology, as well as mundane things like can you drink alcohol or not, these aren't as impactful. I have apologist friends who love tequila and love to drink and are fine with it, and they will cite the verses that say, oh, well, there's no real problem with this. And then, I have folks like my parents who are really opposed to drinking alcohol in any form, and they have their verses that they point to. That inconsistent revelation is not essential to the doctrine. It's not like they think, oh, if you have some alcohol, you're going to hell. And that's why I don't tend to address those inconsistent revelations, and instead go to the ones that seem to deal with how we're saved, what we're saved to, what we're saved from, and all these other notions. But there's a third argument against.
Okay, we'll get to his third argument that he didn't bring in the debate, but that he says he's going to bring in future debates. So if you plan to debate Matt Dillahunty, he tells you here, listen up, this is what I'm going to bring, especially if you're arguing for the existence of the Christian God. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But so he brought here the divine hiddenness argument, and he even mentions, it goes by so quickly it didn't even feel like an argument, or something like that. Right, it didn't, because something you would get a fuller argument from some, philosopher or even just interested YouTube atheist like he is, who actually breaks it down and shows you the premises, because there are full arguments on the divine hiddenness that give us, they're really robust. There's journal articles about this. What we got from Matt was a pretty truncated, just why doesn't God show up more obviously? In fact, I helped to articulate his argument a little bit more during my rebuttal when I said, yeah, I mean, like when bad things happen in life, everyone kind of wants to know, where are you, God, in the midst of all of this? In fact, I liked how one commenter originally on Matt's Facebook page even said, Braxton didn't straw man you, he steel manned you. And for those who don't know, a straw man is when you create the weakest form of something that your opponent has said, or something that they really didn't say, and then you knock that down like you would knock down a straw man, right? It's easy, but it doesn't actually address what they said. A steel man is the inverse of that. A steel man is when you actually present the strongest form of what your opponent has said and then respond to that. This is what I was trying to do. But here's the thing. With the divine hiddenness claim, Matt says, I'm not going to rehash what I said in the debate because I responded to it there and gave what I think is the best answer. But on top of that, Matt says that he wouldn't even believe and worship God believe in the biblical sense of trusting, loyalty, worshiping God, if he were convinced that God exists. He's not sure that he says he wouldn't worship God because he doesn't believe in worship. And so the interesting thing about that is it makes the whole thing, as I said in the debate, it makes the whole discussion of divine hiddenness ring hollow for the debate because what God wants is not for you to just intellectually believe that he exists. He wants people to enter into relationships with him, relationships of loyalty. And if Matt is here telling us that there is no situation in which he would enter into a worshipful relationship with God, well, then why should God provide Matt with this sort of evidence just to suit Matt's fancy if Matt is telling us he wouldn't worship this God even if he intellectually believed that he exists? But I do want to mention something about this inconsistent revelation. Again, I said I'm happy with what I said in the debate about this, but it struck me as I was watching this video that what he's calling inconsistent revelation, what he means by this, is when Christians disagree about things. And he says, I'm not just talking about minor, nuances like whether or not a Christian can drink alcohol, but issues related to bigger, issues of doctrine, maybe like salvation or something. But there's a couple of things I want to say about this. First of all, that's not inconsistent revelation. That's inconsistent interpretation of revelation. So what do we mean when we say revelation? For some of you, this is old hat, but Christian theology discusses general revelation on the one hand. General revelation is what we can know about God from what we see in creation, from what we see by looking at the world around us. In fact, one of the famous passages for this is Romans 1:20, which says, the invisible things of God, his eternal power and divine nature, are clearly seen through what has been made. so that they are without excuse, specifically idolaters, but it works for atheists as well. In other words, you don't have an excuse if you don't believe in one maker God, because there is incredible evidence all around you to believe in that God. There are other things we can learn from general revelation, like what human sexuality is generally supposed to be like, and many, many other things. Morality would fall into that category as well. So general revelation is a very interesting and powerful thing, but then special revelation is like what we get in Scripture, where this is information that is much more specific, and in that sense special than compared to what you would get just from looking at creation around you. And so that's special revelation. So when someone looks at the world around them, the book of nature, as we might say, and then looks at the book of Scripture, and tries to draw conclusions under the leadership of the Holy Spirit, yes, we sometimes, imperfect creatures, come to imperfect conclusions. And in fact, this does lead to problems, that no doubt, I happily grant that. But it also leads to some very exciting and rich discussions. I think sometimes from listening to my atheist friends, and this is just my speculation, I admit that, but I think it's as if they think, if I were to become a Christian, then all the answers, all the search for answers, this quest for knowledge that we enjoy so much goes away, and now we just believe whatever the Bible says. Man, I want to tell you that some of the richest and most exciting discussions happen among Christians who, in coffee shops and in homes and on the internet and in airplanes and in all over the world, have these incredible in-depth discussions with brothers and sisters that we've known for years and ones that we've just met. And so as a result, we have this incredible, deep exploration together that is, I think, invigorating. I think it's an incredible thing. Christians are not one-dimensional, and our God is not one-dimensional. And that quest for knowledge has its own benefits. There's a reason why good teachers have you to try to work out the math problems and the answers to these tough questions of history and science on our own, using the principles we've learned before just giving us the answers, because that quest is part of the joy of learning. And to say that we should take that away merely because we have a God who should just give us all the answers willy-nilly all the time, I just don't get it. But as I said in the debate, one thing that all Christians have always believed, who are orthodox in any sense, is that God exists and God raised Jesus from the dead. We all believe that. And if you don't believe that, you're in no wise really a Christian. And in that sense, we're united. And so this issue of not inconsistent revelation, but inconsistent interpretation of revelation, again, is just kind of falls flat. I'm not sure what we're saying here. One thing I want to point out with both of these two arguments that he raised is it is an example of something that Matt does all the time, and in fact has a book coming out that he's going to title, if he sticks with it, what he says he's going to title it. He titles something that kind of gives this away. It's an example of what we call divine psychology. Divine psychology is when someone tries to psychologize the God that they don't believe in to determine what he would do if he did exist. So in the first case, Matt believes that if God exists, then he should reveal himself in the way that Matt thinks he should reveal himself. Perhaps show up every couple of years and make his presence known every time, all over again, or whatever Matt would say. This really obvious overture from God of neon signs and press conferences, or whatever you want to say. That's how God would do it if God exists. That's what we should expect, he says. We would expect that if God exists. And we would expect that he would come and give us all the answers right from the jump if such a God exists, so that we wouldn't have these inconsistent interpretations of revelation. But think about how strange it is that an atheist is telling us that he knows the God that does not exist, that he doesn't believe in, well enough to know that if such a God did exist, this is how he would do things. I mean, it boggles the mind. I'm not sure that Matt would be able to successfully psychologize me. And he knows me, at least a little bit. He knows me better than he knows God, but yet he's going to be able to tell us what God would do if such a God exists. His book that is forthcoming is supposed to be titled, If I Were God. And I think, if I understand him correctly, that this is kind of going to be part of the subject, is if God exists, he should do it this, that, and the other way, because that's what I would do if I were God. There are quite a few problems with that, but let's not get hung up on this too much longer. Let's move on.
Christianity, which I haven't presented in a debate like this. And it will absolutely be one of those three arguments that I present the next time I debate this. So heads up to anybody who wants to debate Christianity, the divine hiddenness, inconsistent revelation. And the third one will be whether or not there is a soul. And it's because if we have good reason to think that there's no such thing as a soul, which I'm on record as having said the soul is the single most dead concept in all of Christianity, religion, supernaturalism, etc., then clearly Christianity can't be true. But we'll save that for the other debate. Instead, I want to talk about a couple other things.
Okay, and we're going to move much more quickly as we get past this one. But I do want to say something about this. So, his argument he's going to bring in the future is that the soul is the most dead concept in all of psychology or science or whatever, or theology, I guess. It's the most dead concept, and yet if there is no soul, then Christianity can't be true. Now, this is an interesting one for me because, in a sense, I'm inclined to agree that I certainly agree that we have souls, but I'm not sure, and I don't want to try to psychologize Matt or try to read his mind, but I'm not sure he's aware of the field of study out there among Christian physicalists. Now, I personally deny Christian physicalism. But Christian physicalism is the notion that Christianity is true, but we are not a duality of body and soul, that we merely have a physical body, and that physical body will be resurrected one day, and that will go on to live in the kingdom. Now, if you think you see problems with that, I think you're probably right. I see problems with that as well. I have, I think, pretty good arguments for the idea of the soul, and I do think that Scripture makes the best sense on the reading with the soul. So understand me, I think that is a very important idea, and I hold to it, and I have defended it. However, I'm not sure Matt knows this, but there's a mountain of literature out there from Christian physicalists, and it's growing all the time. And these are otherwise conservative evangelicals. So I'm not sure Matt is aware of this, but one of my friends that is a listener to our podcast, who's a student at Fuller, or a graduate of Fuller, perhaps, seminary, tells me that I think he says all but one of the full professors at Fuller are Christian physicalists. And Joel B. Green, who I think at one time was either provost or president of Fuller Seminary, has a book on this subject. And it goes through the biblical data and explains why the biblical data makes better sense in the absence of a soul. And he gives philosophical reasons to believe that there is no soul, but yet Christianity is true. Now, I am at odds with that. I don't buy it. I believe we have souls. However, I don't know if Matt knows that he's going to have to deal with that sort of thing if he raises this. I'm not sure he's aware that he's going to have to deal with all of these arguments, all of these reasons that Christian physicalists raise, and some of these are top shelf philosophers and thinkers. So this idea that if there is no soul, then Christianity goes away or Christianity dies, I'm not sure about that. Now, if I found out that there were no souls, I wouldn't stop being a Christian. I would just have to rethink things. I would just have to change my understanding of certain things. I would have to alter my doctrine of the soul, obviously. But it wouldn't mean that Christianity wasn't true. As I said in the debate, which I just wish people understand, if God exists and God raised Jesus from the dead, Christianity is true, period. These other things, it's not to say there aren't important doctrines. There certainly are. But this is what is central to the truth of the claim that the Christian God exists. Now, let me do say this. So when it comes to the idea of Christian physicalism, it perhaps could be used as a defeater. If I was debating Matt and he raised this issue of the soul, I might point out that there are Christian physicalists and use that as what's known as a philosophical defeater. I'm not sure if you're aware of what philosophical defeaters are. I mentioned them at one point in the question and answer period of this debate when it comes to the issue of miracles. And I think it's going to come up here in just a few minutes again as we look at more of this video. But I want to say that some people may not know what we mean when we say a philosophical defeater. A defeater is not when you know for sure something to be the case, or even have really good reason to believe a particular thing is the case. But so long as it is even remotely possible then it means that the claim against your position doesn't follow. So let me give you an example that I give our students here at Trinity. So if there were three of us, me, Matt, and let's say Billy from the Bible Brodown, all sitting in a room, and Matt from the Bible Brodown leaves, and we stay, in the room during lunch or whatever. And Matt comes back, and let's imagine we're in a room with no windows. Matt comes back, and he's completely drenched with water. Okay, now let's imagine Billy stands up and says there's only one explanation for how Matt became drenched in water. And the explanation is he got into a shower with his clothes on. Now, is that true? Is it true that that's the only possible explanation? That has to be the case? That the reason that Matt is covered in water is because he got into a shower with his clothes on? No, now that is a possibility. That would explain it, but it could well be that it was raining outside and we didn't know it. It could be that Matt fell into a pond and got wet. It could be a number of other things. You say, yeah, but you don't know for sure that it was raining outside. You don't know for sure that he did fall into a pond. Well, that's exactly right. But even the remote possibility that those other options might be true, they serve as defeaters for the claim that the only explanation is that Matt got into a shower with his clothes on, you see? In a similar way, with this Christian physicalism issue, I don't think that Christian physicalism is true, that we don't have a soul. However, so long as it is even remotely possible, then it means the claim that Christianity must be false or shouldn't be believed, or we should take a position of agnosticism or skepticism or whatever Matt wants to promote, fails, because even though I don't believe in Christian physicalism, so long as it is in a remote possibility, it serves as a philosophical defeater to the claim. And so that's how philosophical defeaters work. And of course, I think that would take the wind out of this argument against the soul. Now, again, I want to reiterate, I believe we do have souls, and I think that is an important part of Christian theology. It's just that if I found out that we didn't, it wouldn't mean my Christianity goes away. It would merely mean I have to rethink aspects of what I believe related to anthropology and other issues of Christian doctrine. So that's really all I have to say about this issue of the soul, but perhaps some of my physicalist friends will appreciate that discussion.
Things that happened. One was I wanted in this debate to address as many of the points that my opponent made as possible. And because of the format, essentially he gives his opening remark, I give my opening remark, then he gives a rebuttal, and then I have to essentially rebut the opening and his rebuttal. And so now that's 30 minutes of talking that I have 10 minutes to address, whereas he only has to address 20 minutes in 10. And I get it. That's just the way debates work. It's one of the reasons why I'm pushing for more conversational discussion-based debates where you might give like a 5 or 10-minute opening statement for your position and then a lot of discussion and directed questions, because I think we did not get as much of that in this debate as I would have hoped and as I think other people might have hoped.
Okay, let me say a few things about this debate structure, because he's absolutely right that there are pros and cons to either position you take in a debate. For those that don't know, in a classical debate, you have the affirmative position. So with respect to this issue, does the Christian God exist? I would be taking the affirmative. Matt would be taking the negative, even though Matt doesn't take the negative, that the Christian God does not exist. He takes a middle of the road, I don't know, sort of an answer. We've discussed that in our own videos about this on Trinity Radio, but there are pros and cons to both. Now, I don't think Matt's trying to say here that he was given kind of the short end of the stick, but in case anyone gets that impression, let me point something out. He's right that, so I go first, my opening statements, and then he goes second. And in his opening statements, a good debater won't respond to what his opponent has just said. That's not really fair according to the rules of the debate. You're supposed to wait for your rebuttal to do that. And Matt is a good debater in that respect. He doesn't do that. He waits until his rebuttal. So I go first, he goes second. He hasn't yet responded to anything that I've said. Then I give my rebuttal. And then now this is the first opportunity he's had to respond to anything I've said directly. And he not only has my opening statement, but also my rebuttal to respond to. I grant you that that is the con of his position. That is the con in the pro-con sort of situation. Now, on the other hand, there's a con to my position as well. And that is that whenever I go first, he goes second, I go next with my first rebuttal, and I do get to respond to what he's just said in his openings. But then he goes with his next rebuttal, and there isn't a second rebuttal, which means whatever he says, and this is key, whatever he says in his rebuttal, his one and only rebuttal, I don't get to respond to directly. The only time I'll have to respond to that is if I can work it in my cross-examination or place it during the closing statements. Now, here's where I understand completely people forget things, so I'm not being critical of Leighton Flowers for this. But one thing that did go wrong, kind of, is Leighton forgot that we were supposed to have closing statements. My closing statements would have been my only opportunity to respond directly and without interruption to some of the things that Matt raised in his rebuttal. So there are pros and cons to both of these, and frankly, I think the con that I have here put me in a worse disadvantage, especially considering the fact that I didn't get a closing statement. Now, I'm not whining about that. I don't really care. I just wanted to point that out to anyone who is unaware of how the debate structure can have pros and cons for both sides of the debate. All right, here we go.
But what I did do was I took copious notes, and I've got a system by which I will circle the most important ones and actually rank them as I'm going through. So that when I get up, if you listen to my rebuttal in that debate, it is a rapid fire. Here's what's wrong with this. Here's what's wrong with this. We're not going to have time to go into great detail and explain compatibilism, blah, 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 Because what he presented was, first of all, that if there's not a God, there's no libertarian free will. There is libertarian free will, therefore there is God. And that's not correct. I'm doing that off the top of my head. I just spotted a fallacy in that. So if that's what he said, there's another fallacy. But essentially, it is the argument that if we have libertarian free will, then there must be a God. And no matter how the structure of the argument was, the problem for me, which I addressed fairly quickly, is that I do not believe that we have libertarian free will. By the way, this has nothing to do with the political ideology. It is the notion that if you were to rewind time, you could have done something different.
Okay, first of all, let me say something about this. This is a little bit of a debated point even among libertarians, even among Christians who believe that we have libertarian freedom. And that is, some Christian libertarians would say that to say we have libertarian freedom means primarily that whatever we ended up doing, we could have done something else instead. Now, I do think this is what's called the principle of alternative possibilities. Sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as capital PAP, PAP. And I do agree with the principle of alternative possibilities. I do think that in almost every case, most cases, we have that. But that is not all that's necessary. That's not what's necessary for libertarian freedom. All that is necessary for libertarian freedom is that you are the originator of your actions and that nothing external to you determined what you were going to end up doing or thinking or believing. Nothing determined that for you. So even if you could demonstrate a case where we don't have the principle of alternative possibilities, some people do this with God. Some people think that God could not have done other than whatever he ends up doing, because after all, God's always going to do only the best possible thing, and there's always only one best possible thing, right? So, and also if God knows everything he's going to end up doing, then God has to do whatever he ends up doing because that's what he knows he's going to end up doing. Now, there are other problems with that. But even if we were to grant that problematic statement, that God does not have the principle of alternative possibilities, we would still say that God has libertarian freedom because God is the originator of his actions and everything else, because there is no, especially with God, there's no prior determinism to determine whatever he ends up doing. So all that is necessary for libertarian freedom is that you're the originator of your actions. And this is a little bit of a misunderstanding that Matt has had in the previous video that he made and in this one too. And so it's a nuanced point, but I think he needs to understand it. Now, when someone says, well, if you just say that libertarian freedom is just that you're the originator of your actions and that nothing external to you determines your actions, then that's just compatibilism anyway, right? Because on compatibilism, you're making your own choices, even if it was all determined. And you could, even because on compatibilism, you don't have the principle of alternative possibilities. And you seem to be the originator of your actions. Therefore, it's the same thing. And we just call that libertarian freedom. No, that's completely false, because compatibilism, as Matt at least understands, is determinism. And there is something external to you determining your actions, the causal chain that led to those choices. All that being said, just want to make a clarifying comment there.
That's what libertarian free will is. And as a compatibilist, to whatever extent that still applies, because I had a great discussion with rationality rules about free will, and I've pretty much agreed to talk about, I believe that we have will. How free it is up for discussion or debate, but I still am fairly convinced by Dan Dennett's compatibilism that there's nothing about determinism that necessarily eliminates all varieties of free will. But rather than spending any time arguing or discussing how free our will is, it doesn't matter, because even Dan Dennett doesn't believe we have libertarian free will. The vast majority of neuroscientists that I've interacted with that have studied these sorts of things and beginning to see how the brain works don't think we have libertarian free will. And so my question...
Okay, wait a minute. This is a point that I was prepared to discuss in the debate but never got brought up. He tried to bring it up and then he backed off. And Dr. Pritchett says that he suspects that what happened there was that Matt was kind of testing the waters by mentioning the neuroscience stuff. But then when I seemed prepared, because he brought up neuroscience studies, and I said, yeah, like Libet experiments, which I'll explain in a moment, like Libet experiments, and I'm happy to talk about that. And then he went in another direction. I can't speculate as to whether that was because of what Dr. Pritchett suspects, but I can say that I was ready to talk about it. So let's mention something about this now. The idea that neuroscience has disproven or given strong evidence against libertarian freedom. Let me first explain... let me see here. Let me first explain what we have on this. There was an article from 2018. Now, this is 2018. This is just last year. The article is titled, "The Impact of a Landmark Neuroscience Study on Free Will, a Qualitative Analysis of Articles Using Libet and Colleagues' Methods." Now, so this is what this is there was a qualitative study of the research that has been done over, I think, the past several decades on free will within neuroscience. And the people that did this qualitative study of these experiments, this is what they had to say. Quote, "We found that interpretation of study results appears to have been driven by the metaphysical position the given author or authors subscribed to, not by a careful analysis of the results themselves. Basically, those who opposed free will interpreted the results to support their position and vice versa. Meanwhile, the journal articles that drew most forceful conclusions often didn't even assess the neural activity in question, which means their conclusions were based on speculation. It is crucial to critically examine whether the methods used actually support the claims being made." So what this qualitative study revealed was that the conclusions of these neuroscience studies were based on the metaphysical presuppositions that the people running the studies, or writing the articles anyway, had. And so if you're a skeptic, and this is something that was mentioned in maybe Scientific America or one of the ones that reported on this, is that if you're a skeptic, score 1 for skepticism, right, Matt? Because it means that you should be highly skeptical of the conclusions of both the libertarians, the compatibilists, and the determinists on the basis of the neuroscience evidence, because what we have is biased evidence according to this. One example of those things is the well-known Libet experiments. Let me explain real quickly what a Libet experiment is. Libet was the last name of the person who originally conducted these experiments, if I understand correctly. Libet came to the conclusion. What he did was, let me give you an example of the modern iterations of these, because there are various examples of Libet experiments that have been carried out. So what they did was they put electrodes on the scalp of the person who's the subject and on their arm. And what they would do is they would have two buttons. This is not how they originally did it. They originally did it with a clock face. But let's imagine that you have two buttons, and you have to decide when and which button to push. And so what happens is when you decide and you make a movement in your wrist or whatever to push a button, a light comes on before you are aware that you made a choice. And this is gauging electrical activity in the different spheres of the brain to try and show that the decision is determined before you're aware of your making the decision. The idea there is that the decision was made before you really came to a conclusion, which means free will is a myth. It doesn't really exist, or at least it seems to give evidence toward that. Let me just say it again. So it seems like, based on neural activity, that the decision is already made before you go to make the motion to select one button or the other. Now, there are problems with this. Even if we grant this, there are problems with this, and Libet himself did not believe that this did away with free will. He thought it just nuanced our understanding of free will. Marcus E. Schlosser explains the problem thusly. However, on the basis of further experiments and some observations, Libet also argued that there is evidence for what he called veto control. During debriefing, some subjects reported that they had sometimes chosen not to act on the urge to move, thereby aborting the action. And in similar experiments in which subjects were asked to first prepare and then abort the movement, EEG signals were obtained that resembled the recordings of RPs. This suggests, according to Libet, that the time window of about 200 milliseconds between W and the onset of the movement allows subjects to consciously veto and abort the performance of the action. Now, let me put it in my own words here. So here's what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that, yes, in this case of picking between two buttons and the movement of your wrist, it does seem to be the case that the impulse to pick one over the other and when to do that was determined before the subject becomes conscious of that choice and goes to act. But there is a window in which, even after the person does become aware of which one they're going to choose, they can veto the action or abort. They can stop the action. So the most you could get out of Libet experience is not that we have no free will, but that we do have free won't. The veto action means that even if it were demonstrated that a complex choice, and not merely a flexing of a muscle, as these experiments involved, were made prior to the subject's awareness of that choice, the subject still seems to have the ability to refrain, veto, abort, or cancel the decision. Now, I can't help but point out that if this were the case, it would actually support Christian thinking on the nature of man. The natural inclination, for instance, to do some sinful act may exist, but we can refrain from that sinful act. So there's a couple of problems. I hope they're clear to you now. One is that even if we don't have, in these situations of picking between buttons or whatever, even if the decision is made prior to our awareness of the decision, we can still decide to veto it. So you still have free will, and if you want to call that free won't or veto power, you can do that, but it gets you to the same conclusion, free will. And secondly, what this doesn't address is complex decisions. So what this has to do with is your impulsive choice to pick one of two options without really much rhyme or reason. That's kind of the point, is there's really not a thinking through it. It's just you pick one or the other. And it's more like, and this is what people in the field refer to as the difference between picking and choosing. Picking is more like, this arbitrary choice of two buttons. But a choice has more to do with, should I buy this present for my wife or should I buy that present? Should I marry this person or that person? Should I go into this field of study or that field of study? What should I eat for lunch today? And you think through these, and there's data that's coming in and you're trying to make a decision. You see, that's a much more complex, it's not an impulsive decision like that. So there are a lot of problems with this. And so when people write on these, according to this qualitative study, what they've done is they have interpreted the data according to bias. So the neuroscience doesn't really help you with this. And I thought that needed to be mentioned here. So let's go on and listen to a little bit more. I hope this is interesting to you guys. I feel like I'm just droning on.
That I asked that was important was, I don't believe we have free will. How could you possibly demonstrate that we had free will? This particular variety. We are unable to rewind time. So it's an untestable proposition. And I would like to know how somebody goes about determining that we have libertarian free will. And essentially, if you watch the debate, please correct me if I'm paraphrasing this incorrectly, but there was no evidence for libertarian free will. It was just an assertion by Braxton that he feels like he has it, and it would be absurd to think that he doesn't. Well, that's about what he is or isn't convinced of. And even if he's correct, any reasonable objective observer would have to look at Braxton and say, okay, he's completely convinced that he has libertarian free will and finds it absurd to think that he doesn't. And Matt is absolutely not convinced that we have libertarian free will, and I added, finds it absurd to think that libertarian free will is compatible with the notion of the God that he's talking about. Because if I truly...
Okay, we're going to get to that in just a moment, but let's respond to this, because this is really the key moment. This is the thing that I most want to deal with, because he said this in both of his videos, And I just think, did you watch the debate back, Matt, to see if that's really all that I presented? I presented 3 lines of evidence in defense of premise 2. And so, yes, it's a very inelegant explanation of what I've said when he says, well, I just feel like I have it. This is what we call the principle of credulity. Richard Swinburne uses it in his argument from religious experience. I'm not using it there, but I'm using it in the same way. And the idea is that if a person has a belief that they find almost impossible to doubt, then they're justified in maintaining that belief until such a time as someone provides them good enough reason to overturn that belief in favor of something else. Now, Matt kind of mocked, or at least found this humorous or amazing in the debate. And another brother who made a video about this pointed this out. Matt says that that actually is a fallacy, to say that you should believe something until someone convinces you otherwise. But then only moments later in the debate, Matt says about the issue of whether other people exist and whether the external world is real. He says, I'm happy to go on believing that. It seems to be real. It seems to be true. And I'm going to go on believing that until such a time as someone gives me good reason to think otherwise. This is exactly what you just said was a fallacy. And so it's interesting that only moments later this comes up. And so someone, you can go look for it, has put together a neat little video in which they explain that and point that out. So that's worth mentioning. Secondly, I brought the argument that he doesn't mention here, that if libertarian freedom does not exist, then rational affirmations are impossible. Let me give you an example of what this is like. So imagine that you just, and this illustration is from Tim Stratton. If you imagine that you just found out that a mad scientist was controlling your every thought, your every belief, your every action, including the next words that are going to come out of your mouth and what you're thinking right now. Would you, and you don't have any way to access the motivations of this mad scientist, do you now have any justification for believing, or trusting, I should say, anything that you think or believe or do? Do you have any justification for it? Of course not. Because you don't know what this mad scientist's opinions are, or what he's trying to do. The situation on naturalistic determinism is even worse than that, because on naturalistic determinism, it's not some mad scientist somewhere. There simply is no one. It's just the blind forces of nature at work, resulting in whatever you end up believing. Rationality is reducible definitionally to reason, which is the process by which you deliberate over data and choose which thing you should affirm, right? But if libertarian freedom does not exist, every step of that process, your thinking through of things, is all determined and could not have been otherwise, which means that the person who ends up believing that he is a unicorn got there through a purely determinative thinking process, just as Matt Dillahunty arrived at his belief that, that he shouldn't say whether God exists or whatever Matt's position is on that. He got there through a purely determinative process. And at no juncture was he really picking and choosing. So you have no justification for rational affirmations. You can affirm things, but you can't rationally affirm them. And if you can't rationally affirm things, then you can't really have a claim to knowledge. So what one would need to do is one would need to go home and think through his epistemology and figure out how on a determinative system you could have rational affirmations, because at least then you'd be able to know something. And I'm not trying to be pejorative, but that's just the way it works. What was Matt's response to that? Because here's the thing. You could respond and say, well, we just feel like we're able to make rational affirmations. But of course, no atheist wants to say that, because if they say we just feel like we're making rational affirmations, then this is all pointless, right? That we have no justification for concluding or arguing for anything. We can't be rational. So no one wants to say that. So he can't respond to that with, well, you just feel like you have these rational affirmations so that you can feel like you have libertarian freedom. But if you have rational affirmations and they're legitimate, then libertarian freedom comes along with that. And of course, libertarian freedom, along with that comes God. So let's hear what Matt has to say in response to this in the debate.
The calculator could be right, but it's purely a deterministic piece of technology, right? Basically.
Yes.
Here's the thing. That kind of proves my point, because my position is that if libertarian freedom does not exist, then rational affirmations are impossible. That doesn't mean that your beliefs are false. In fact, if it were possible for a person to have, and I don't know that there's anything contradictory about this, for a person to have 100% true beliefs, they could have 100% true beliefs, and yet they didn't get there rationally.
Sure.
And the reason for that is because rationality definitionally is reducible to reason, and reason is the process by which you deliberate over between beliefs and choose which is a good or a bad thing to affirm. And if libertarian freedom does not exist, then we don't have rationality is impossible because you can't choose against the irrational.
Yeah, I don't think that I accept that at all, because
I didn't expect you to.
we are decision-making machines, and the things that feed into us, the fact that we're having an argument or whatever else, somebody may or may not become convinced, and to them they may have this experience of, oh, I've changed my position on this. Nothing about determinism suggests or implies that you cannot change your decision based on new information that you receive, that you're not a computer being it's the fact that it's more complex obfuscates that, which is
this is key. What I want you to understand is happening here is Matt's saying that first of all, it's a straw man to say that what I'm, and I don't think he intends to straw man me. I think he's frankly unfamiliar with this argument, and so as a result thought I was saying something that I wasn't. So I think you were straw manning me there, Matt, but I don't think you meant to straw man me, so that's okay. But it's a straw man to say that I'm saying, well, it's not like you can't listen to someone and change your mind about things. They can listen and take in information and change your mind. Of course, I agree. I agree that if determinism were true, people can listen to what other people are saying and change their mind. That's not the point. The point is that every step of that reasoning, what we would normally call reasoning process, is determined every step of the way, such that you had no choice about what you were going to end up affirming, which means that it is not a process of deliberation, and you're not free to choose against that which is irrational, so you can't call your affirmations rational. Now, he actually did say something interesting, and it wasn't actually a good response to what I've said. It was an admission. What he said was, it obfuscates. The complexity of it obfuscates this. Now, understand what he's saying is, I'm here arguing that if determinism is true, the history of the universe, including our choices, is like dominoes in a chain. When Matt says the complexity of it obfuscates that, what he's saying is not that it isn't dominoes, but that it's like millions of dominoes. That's basically what he's saying. It's so complex that it in every other way, it seems like a free choice or a rational choice. But understand, I don't care if it's billions of dominoes or one chain of dominoes. In any case, it's determined all the same. And I was waiting to give this answer at some point in the debate, but I either didn't remember to, or I didn't get the chance. But here's the answer. All you're attempting to do when you try to have morality on determinism, or you're trying to have rationality on determinism, and you're pointing to this, how complex it all is you're trying to bury the negative implications of determinism in the complexity of the determinism, which does not in any wise resolve the problem. So I just wanted to point this out. I brought that line of evidence. Also, I brought the line of evidence that has to do with moot morality. Matt wants to hold on to the idea that morality is not moot, that it is meaningful, that we can be morally responsible agents and that in a meaningful way. And my third defense of premise 2, that libertarian freedom does exist, is that if libertarian freedom does not exist and we're left with determinism, then we have moot morality. That is, that we can hold people punishable. So if someone becomes a sex offender, a racist engaging in a hate crime, a pedophile, or whatever, we can hold them punishable in a practical sort of way because that's good for society or whatever, but we can't hold them blameworthy, because ultimately they could not have done otherwise. And there are actually some philosophers and even a foundation, I think, that's actually working on better ways to, this is like an atheistic, naturalistic, determinist foundation that's looking for better ways to handle criminal justice, because we have to understand that these people couldn't have done otherwise. Now, folks, if your position leads you to the conclusion that when someone engages in a hate crime against African Americans or homosexuals or women or whatever. If that's what your position, if you have to say about that, and I'm not saying Matt would say this, but if you have to say about that, they couldn't help it. It's not their fault, really. They couldn't help it. They're not really blameworthy. They're not really, and people that build wells in Africa or try to help people, philanthropists, they're not really praiseworthy. I'm sorry. That is an extraordinary claim. And as Matt said a while ago, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? So that's, to say that all I said in response in defense of the idea that libertarian freedom exists is merely that I feel like I have it, is to completely ignore the 3 lines of evidence and only to focus on a poor representation of one of the lines of reasoning I gave. I gave 3. Matt only dealt with 1 and didn't deal with it, I don't think, on good grounds. And then the thing that he criticized about it, he raises later in the debate, only moments later, committing the same thing that he calls a fallacy. So I just wanted to point all of that out, and hopefully that will be helpful. Is there anything else I want to say about that? No, I think we'll go on to the next thing that he says and see where it goes from here.
Really have libertarian free will, then a God couldn't reliably predict my actions in order to make prophecies about things in the future. And so you'd have to get into, what does God know about the future? How reliable is God's knowledge of the future? And you get into apologetics where God is removed from time as if he can see all of reality on like a video recording type thing. So he knows what's going to happen and you still have free will. But the counter to that is, if God created the universe and God knew what was going to happen and God could have created a different universe, then that means, and this was the question I raised, that God picked this particular universe of others. If in some other universe I had exercised my libertarian free will and wound up as a Southern Baptist preacher, and in this one I exercised my libertarian free will and ended up as an atheist, if God specifically picked the universe in which he knew I was going to exercise my free will in this way, then I didn't have free will. God specifically chose the universe in which I become an atheist. This is a problem. And so Braxton's response to it was essentially, maybe there was no viable universe under which you, through the characteristics, meaning me, Matt, under the characteristics of my brain, would have chosen a different path. It's not that I couldn't, it's that I wouldn't. And I get that. And there's nothing wrong with that response, other than it's just another unfounded assertion. He can't demonstrate this at all. It is an ad hoc hypothesis in an attempt to explain away a real problem. So to the extent that we're able to investigate this notion of free will at all, we have no evidence for it, an assertion that it's absurd to think we don't have it, and that maybe God, in every universe that God could have created, I would not have chosen to follow or continue following Christ. But that's just an ad hoc way of dismissing the objection. It's not an answer to anything. And so looking at it, we have a completely untestable scenario here.
Okay. So first of all, as he lists off with his fingers there, so here it's we don't have any good reason to believe we have libertarian freedom. Well, I gave you 3 lines of evidence and you completely missed 2 of them, and so I would encourage you to go back and take a look at those. And again, I don't mean to be too straightforward, Matt. If you see this, I don't mean to be insulting, but I'm just trying to be frank. I don't think you dealt with the evidence that I did provide for that. When it comes to with God, so Matt raises this idea that free will is incompatible with the Christian idea of God because there would be no way for God to know what the future free choices of man would be, before he then goes on to explain several viable options for how God might know what those future free choices of man will be. So, I don't know. Secondly, he then points out that, we don't know. I want to point out something here. You don't have to know how something works in order to know that it works. Matt doesn't know how the universe, our local representation of the universe came into existence. But he believes that this local representation of our universe anyway did come to exist at a certain point. He doesn't have to know how that works to know that it works. I don't know when I turn on my car how the engine works, but I do know that it works, right? I don't have to know exactly how it is that God as a necessary being knows the future free choices of man or how that omniscience works. But I know that it works, okay? There's a difference in these different, there's a difference here between knowing that and knowing how. So I think that that needs to be mentioned. When it comes to this idea of God choosing the world in which Matt will believe or not, now I answered this in the debate, so I won't belabor it too much here. He did actually represent it somewhat fairly, what I said with that, which is there a possible world in which Matt remains a follower of Christ? Yes, there is a possible world like that. There's nothing contradictory about that world. But is there a feasible world? You know, when God gives man libertarian freedom, we get a subset of possible worlds, and it's from those worlds that God makes that God can choose which world to create if he's going to create a world of free creatures, which he doesn't have to do, but if he's going to create a world of free creatures, then he gets a subset. And it may be that in none of those worlds of free creatures does Matt Dillahunty ever freely choose to remain a Christian or remain, however you want to frame that up, again, soteriologically, remain in the church, remain or become a follower of Christ, whatever. The bottom line about this is if Matt Dillahunty, the Matt Dillahunty we know in the actual universe, has an epistemological framework where, let's remember what he says, if someone parted an ocean in Jesus' name, he would not believe. If it were written on the moon in multiple languages after an asteroid collision, he wouldn't believe. If a man's head was cut off and an hour later, without human involvement, his head reattached and the person began to testify to Matt about a conversation that he had just had with someone in the afterlife, about a conversation that only Matt and that person would have known about, Matt still wouldn't believe anything supernatural happened. Not just that he wouldn't believe Christianity, he wouldn't believe something supernatural happened. This is by his own admission. If that's the case, then it may be that there is no world of free creatures where such a person would choose to become a Christian or remain a Christian or whatever. Secondly, even if I didn't go that far, the fact of the matter is, the idea that God selects among worlds of libertarianly free creatures does not mean that you don't have libertarian free will. It means God chose among worlds in which you have libertarian free will. Now understand, it is simply definitionally wrong to say that if in world A, B, and C, Matt Dillahunty freely, with libertarian freedom, takes actions that are different and God chooses to actualize world B instead of A or C, it doesn't mean that in world B, Matt Dillahunty didn't have libertarian freedom. It just means God chose to actualize a world in which Matt had libertarian freedom and did whatever Matt Dillahunty did. I mean, just definitionally, that's just incorrect. You would still have libertarian freedom. But I understand why some people think that there's too much determinism in that for what some Christians typically say about it. But I don't know what the problem is ultimately supposed to be. But yes. Now, the deeper issue that he raises is he says, I'm just making it up, basically. I don't have any evidence that this is what's happening. He says basically, yeah, that's fine. And I take him to mean, yeah, that would resolve it if that's the case. But you're just making an assertion. Let's go back to our discussion of defeaters again. I don't know for sure whether God chose among these feasible worlds or not. Matt's the one who raises that. I personally think it's probably the case that God knows what would have happened if he'd created differently and chose to create this way because he knew these things would happen. I think that's true. That's an expression of what's known in theology as God's middle knowledge, and I do affirm middle knowledge. However, it may well be that's not the case, that God doesn't have middle knowledge. But so long as that's even possible, it serves as a philosophical defeater to the claim that God chose this world because he wanted a world where Matt doesn't remain a Christian, or whatever it is that Matt's raising here that he thinks is problematic. This serves as a defeater for that. Remember the defeaters? Remember the discussion about defeaters earlier in this video? This is a philosophical defeater. I was raising it as a philosophical defeater. Now, in this case, I actually believe it to be the case, but it's still a philosophical defeater. So I think Matt just needs to understand how in logical discussions, philosophical discussions, how we use these different features, how we use these different ideas in argumentation, And if he would just understand that I'm using this as a defeater, then the problem dissolves almost completely. So I just don't see or completely, I think. So just wanted to point that out. Let's move on.
The other two arguments that Braxton presented, a version of the Kalam, which is problematic because it doesn't get to Christianity. So,
okay, I want to say something here. The Kalam, and he's going to say more about it in just a moment, doesn't get us to Christianity. Right. As I said in my opening statements, the idea is that I'm going to show first that a God exists, and then with the resurrection case, I'm going to show that it's the Christian God. This is how classical apologetics works, and frankly, I think Matt's aware of this, because in his 2017 debate with Mike Licona, he actually points this out. He says this is, I think at some point in the debate, he says either that this is why William Lane Craig presumes, for the sake of argument, presumes or presupposes that God exists before he makes his resurrection case, or gives evidence for a God's existence before moving on to the resurrection, because the hypothesis, the resurrection hypothesis, is stronger if you have a sufficiently powerful being like God to do something like a resurrection. So Matt understands how this works. So I'm not quite sure why this seems like he wants to knock the Kalam out, just say, why do we don't need it? No, it serves its role in this debate. It's very important. And also because I think that in this is an issue where I really find it troubling that many internet atheists seem to think that people like Matt Dillahunty have already resolved this issue of the Kalam, when as we saw in the debate, Matt's not familiar with, I don't think, some of the terminology, some of the issues that are raised in this discussion. For example, there's this great moment in the debate where he says, I say, how is it that the universe could be past infinite? He says, how could your God be past infinite? And I said, well, he's timeless. And he says, well, it doesn't matter what you believe. And I said, no, I'm just telling you definitionally he's timeless. We have this back and forth. He didn't understand that what I was saying was, if God is timeless, then he's not past infinite. He's timeless. Those are different categories. Infinite, past infinite, is temporal language. It's temporal and infinite. Timeless is not temporal. Those are completely different categories. And it threw me in the debate because I had to realize, oh, wait a minute, he doesn't understand that these are different. And so when I finally pointed it out, so he's not infinite into the past, he's timeless. He says, oh, yeah, you didn't say that before. Okay, well, we're okay, then move on. And I was shocked because Matt's supposed to be the guy who has thoroughly debunked the Kalam argument. And I found that, number one, he seemed unfamiliar with some of the responses, especially when we got to state, event, causation. This he didn't seem to have a relevant response to this. And worse than all of that, when we got to a corner where it seems clear and undeniable, not just that you can't think of anything else, but it just can't be that the universe is past infinite because it leads to logical impossibilities. Matt's response is, I don't know. And this is where I want to say about I don't know what I've been saying recently, which is I don't know is noble and honorable if you don't know and now you're going to go find the answer. But I don't know as a strategy to avoid a response from your opponent that you can't get around. And I'm sorry, again, I don't want to be uncool to Matt, but this certainly seems like what's happening. When it is the response because you can't get around something and you're stuck because your opponent has presented something that you can't resolve, saying I don't know as your argument almost is a big problem. I'm a big fan of I don't know, but I don't know is an opportunity for me to go learn something. And if I'm debating someone and they present something that I have no response for, then I'm confronted. I may have to believe what they're saying. I have to at least admit that much. Unless, of course, I don't want to give up my ground. I don't know what's going on in Matt's head. I can't gauge that. But I can say that I don't know can't be the get out of jail free card when you can't defeat something that your opponent raises. And I think it is being used, if not by Matt, by many YouTube atheists as a sort of a get out of jail free card, as a begging off, a cop-out to the answer. That and punting to science when we're talking about philosophical issues. There are other things I want to say about that, but I'll just move on at this point because I want to keep this rather short.
So we could have just skipped past that and said that Essentially, Braxton's convinced there had to have been a creator, and he's going to call that creator the Christian God. And the third one was about the resurrection, and quite honestly, unless I'm misremembering, I don't know that there was actually much evidence presented for the resurrection. What was presented, to my recollection, was more about the claims about the resurrection. And the claims aren't evidence. The claims are the claims. You need additional evidence for that.
Yeah, so this is interesting because I actually think this is key in the debate. The debate question was, does the Christian God exist? And I took a full half of my opening statements to present a case for the resurrection. Now, he says all I did was present what the scholars say. And it is interesting that the scholars agree universally. And when I say universally, there are always outliers, guys like Bob Price or Richard Carrier. But the scholars almost universally agree that that Jesus thought of himself as God's special eschatological agent. And we have an entire episode devoted to that, by the way. And I was prepared to defend that point in the debate if pressed on it. We have an episode of that. It has NASA in the title. It's something like how NASA helps us understand the resurrection or something. You can go check that out. It's very recent. And then the universally, scholars agree that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, that people had experiences that they interpreted as the appearances of the risen Christ, and that people were willing, these earliest disciples of Jesus were willing to die for the claim. These are bedrock facts. They enjoy the consensus of scholarship. Now, I did point that out, but in my opening statements, I did also point out evidential pieces for each one of these. I didn't spend a lot of time on it because we're in our opening statements, and we have to keep moving. But with the death of Jesus, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion, I pointed out that Tacitus, who is the greatest scholar of ancient Rome, testifies to this. Now, a lot of times people want to throw Tacitus out and say, well, he just heard that from Christians. But Tacitus is known for not reporting hearsay. When he doesn't know something for sure, he often says, just read Tacitus, he often says, I'm not sure about this, or I heard this from so-and-so, or I don't know. He doesn't say that with this issue about Jesus. And as the greatest historian of ancient Rome, he would have likely had access to documentation on these events. So, but we don't just have Tacitus. If I was pressed on it, even though I mentioned that in my opening statements, I could have also mentioned Josephus. Now, people think that Josephus had an interpolation, and where a Christian author came back and added to it to make it, add these grand Christian flourishes about Jesus, and that is pretty well undeniable. We do agree that that's the case. However, this is what he says in the piece that's relevant to Jesus' death. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. Now, there are interpolations, but not in what I just read, because actually Josephus scholars think that they're able to get to the original statement that without the interpolations. On top of that, we have an Arabic version, and I just read you the Arabic version that doesn't have the interpolation. I think there may be one more. I think there may be a Latin version too that doesn't have the interpolation. So we have Tacitus, Josephus, the rabbinic writings, of course, the gospel accounts, and Paul. And you can't just throw out the gospel accounts in Paul. The way that we do this, and Matt hasn't done this, but in grown-up scholarship, what we do is we take a look at the statements in the New Testament, and we don't say, because this is just Christian propaganda material, and throw it out. No, we say, what good reason do we have to believe this statement, and then this statement, and then this statement? And we look at each one. Now, I'm not saying that as a Christian, I believe the Gospels. I believe the whole of the Bible. But I'm saying when we're doing historical studies, that's how we operate. We don't just throw the whole thing out. You want to go to these sources, these earliest sources that we can get. And even according to Bart Ehrman, if you want to know about the life of Jesus and the movements of the disciples and things like that, you can do no better than going back to the Gospels. So that's what we're doing here. So we've got Tacitus, Josephus, the rabbinic writings, the gospel accounts, Paul. I mean, what more do you want? And in the words of Bart Ehrman, Tacitus' report confirms what we know from other sources, that Jesus was executed by order of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, sometime during Tiberius' reign. That's from Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium from 2001, page 59. So I had that evidence for the death of Jesus, and I mentioned the Tacitus thing in my opening statements. As for that people thought they had appearances of the risen Jesus, well, of course, this is amply attested in Scripture itself. in the writings of Paul and in the Gospels. But on top of that, you have Josephus again. They reported that he had already appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. So that's from the same section of Scripture that we just read from, and that's from the Arabic version without the interpolation. So we have it from Josephus. We have this biblical data. You have it in the Creed of the Early Church in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 6. And by the way, I mentioned that in my opening statements. That was an evidential piece that I referenced in my opening statements, what is known as the Creed of the Early Church in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. And that went unaddressed. So, and then as far as the people died martyrs' deaths, the earliest Christians were willing to die for their belief. Is that really controversial? Is that a controversial claim? I think that most people agree, but I was happy to discuss that. I have the data related to that. For example, Peter, Paul, and James, son of Zebedee, according to Sean McDowell's dissertation, got the highest possible probability. And I can point you to the sources for this. There are multiple sources. Let's just take the Peter's martyrdom. We have 1 Clement 5, 4 through 5, Ignatius, letter to the Samaritans, Apocalypse of Peter 14:4, Ascension of Isaiah 4, 2 through 3, the Acts of Peter, Dionysius of Corinth, Eusebius, Ecclesiastical History 225, Tertullian, Scorpius 15. And so all of this and the lack of any competing narrative weighs favorably for the traditional view. The early and persistent tradition is that Peter was martyred for his faith. So I mentioned ample evidence as well. Let me say this. I mentioned evidential features such as Tacitus and such as the 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 creed, and that it's understood as a creed of the early church, in addition to the scholars that I mentioned. So this is just false. And what's telling is, now this is a point where I didn't get to have my own rebuttal right after his. So I didn't get to come back and say anything about that. So I had to fit it in during my cross-ex. In my cross-ex, I directly asked Matt, is it the case that you're not going to bring a competing hypothesis to the resurrection? He says, correct. That, frankly, is damning in a debate where the question of the debate is, does the Christian God exist? It is absolutely damning and shocking. So, on balance right there, I don't know how you can claim victory, as Matt did in his previous video. I don't know how you claim victory when you didn't address the resurrection case that I brought. You just brushed it off as my simply counting scholars, when that's not all I did. So that seems like a very important piece of the puzzle as far as all this goes. Now, we're about done here. I'm going to skip ahead toward the end of the video. I'm going to skip ahead to, let's see. He starts talking about skepticism somewhere around minute 13, minute 14. He starts talking about Stargate and aliens and how you can't, the arguments that Christians bring can be just as well explained by a sufficiently advanced intelligence like aliens or something to do with Stargate. The thing about that is, the beginning of the universe can't be addressed by aliens. And that was the argument that I think Matt struggled with the most. I think he struggled just as much with the free will argument, but I just don't think he understood what I was saying well enough to respond appropriately. I think that's why he's had to continue to say that all I did was say, I feel like I have it. But you certainly can't posit aliens as an explanation for the beginning of the universe. So I think he admits that there he's kind of leaving the debate and just going off on evolution and teleology and where his levels of skepticism are and all those kind of things. So I don't really feel compelled to talk about that. I didn't raise those in this debate. I didn't talk about evolution. I didn't talk about that. I think this was just him trying to answer the question of whether he's too skeptical, like the topic, the title of the YouTube video implies. But I don't know what to say about that. When you're saying that you wouldn't believe if the ocean was parted in Jesus' name, then yeah, I think you're too skeptical. Here's the thing. He says that he has this t-shirt that says, I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. I'm not the first one to point out that you could accomplish this task in a couple of ways. First of all, you could be a total cynic and never believe anything that anyone ever tells you. And then you would never end up believing anything false, but you also wouldn't believe any of the true things, right? And that's not what Matt wants. Or you could believe everything anyone ever tells you, and you would end up believing all the true things, but you also end up believing a lot of the false things. And that's not what Matt wants, and that's not what any of us want. Matt wants that middle of the road. But I'm not sure skepticism is the best way to get there. Because what you're doing there is you're having to make a choice about where to lean, which direction to lean. And so you're leaning toward the skepticism as the safer alternative here. The problem is it's not the safer alternative, because it is just as dangerous to disbelieve certain true things as it is to believe certain false things. And so, I think the way to avoid all of that is to back off on the skepticism. And a level of skepticism is good, but it shouldn't be a level of skepticism where if you receive something like someone parting the ocean in Jesus' name, or someone coming back from the dead in front of you, or it being written on the moon after an asteroid collision, this incredibly complex thing. If your skepticism wouldn't allow you to entertain that something supernatural is going on, then you're leaning too far skeptical. And I get it. You think that that's safer because you don't want to believe false things. But it's just as dangerous to disbelieve certain true things as it is to believe certain false things.